good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the first APRU webinar, What's the New Normal for Student Mobility and Recruitment. My name is Elaine Hung, APRU's Events and Relations Manager, and I'm the host of today's webinar. Before we begin, I would like to invite Dr. Christopher Tremewan, APRU Secretary General, to say a few words of welcome. Chris, over to you, please.
Thank you, Elaine. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar on an issue which is confronting so many universities in a time of crisis, which already builds on a period when we had many issues to face in terms of inequality and climate change and so on. And then this is on the top of it. And we as universities have to respond educationally and in our research. So I'm looking forward to the panelists, and I wish to thank the moderator and panelists who will be introduced for contributing to this webinar. I just want briefly to introduce APRU and to say that we are an association of research universities around the Asia Pacific, mainly the APEC economies, and we're about 55 universities across 19 economies. So we see ourselves as something of a connector between universities and other partners on the issues of the day to foster innovation and exchange of knowledge. So those of you who don't know us, that's an overview, and you can find out more about us by going onto our website. We've also responded to the COVID-19 situation in this uncertain time by having this, amongst other series, this particular webinar on addressing the crisis. So we've called this series APRU Plus, and we want to bring together our diverse community of people who lead, create, inspire, and so that we can learn together. And you can already find on our website other aspects of what our members are doing in this crisis situation, the policies and actions they're doing to respond to it. And so we've also prepared this hub of our activities, and you can see some of them up on the screen under these thematic activities, webinars focused on not only on higher education themes, but also on some of these global issues from global health, sustainable cities, and multi-hazards, and so on. We also are promoting student interactions online and new experiences. We encourage everybody to enter the Quarantine Student Music Competition if you're a student. And we're also putting up resources for universities to share about what they're doing. So please visit this website as well, apruplus.org. So do stay connected to us and enjoy this webinar. I'm sure we have the top people in the field to talk to us, and I look forward to it very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. So I will now invite our moderator of today, Ms. Tanya Rose Taylor from the University of Sydney. Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you, Chris, for those kind words, and thank you to everyone for giving up your time today, whatever time of day it is, for you to join us in this important conversation. One of the things that's really struck me about how universities have responded to this crisis, and my portfolio includes many of those teams that are on the front line of the crisis, is the amount of innovation that universities have shown and how they've responded to the challenge. And that's kind of what this session is about today. So it's about how universities and colleges are having to adjust their ways of operating in uncertain and an ever-changing landscape brought on by COVID-19. So there were pressures in the system before COVID-19. COVID-19 has brought those to the fore. But what we've already seen is a shift to, in some areas, entirely online teaching and learning across much of the higher education sector. whilst that's beneficial, we've also seen that students are desperate for a face-to-face education. So how do we blend the learnings from moving online to and taking the best of that to that kind of new model of blended learning? And we've also seen how this has significantly impacted on international student recruitment and mobility. So we have an incredible panel of experts here today to discuss what this means from their own institutions and the sector. And they're coming to us from across the world. So we have someone from the University of Sydney in Australia, we have someone from Yonsei in South Korea, and someone from the University of Washington in Seattle. So three quite similar and quite different perspectives, which I think will give us a chance to have a look at this in the round. So the sorts of things that we're going to be asking is, you know, how does this change the way that we recruit students domestically? How's it going to change the way that we admit students? How's it going to impact student mobility? And does it mean that the in situ global experience is now dead, or is it still alive? Is there a role for global experiences in a virtual context? And how do we support each other and maintain our partnerships in this context? You will see that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It's that Q&A button that will allow you to ask questions, and we'll answer those after we've done the presentations. Please, if you've got questions, ask them. If we know the answer, we'll answer them. If we don't, we'll come back to you afterwards. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, which is Kim Labus, who's Director of International Student Services and Associate Director of International Admissions at the University of Washington. Thank you, Kim.
Great. Thank you, Tanya. Well, good evening from Seattle, where it is about 6 p.m. here. And I'll get started in just 1 second with my presentation. So I'm Kim Levis. I'm the Director of International Student Services at the University of Washington. And I'm also the Associate Director for International Admissions at the undergraduate level. So to start, I'll just give a little bit of background about the university for those that may not know. So we are a large public research university. We have 3 campuses, all located here in the west side of Washington State in Seattle, Bothell, and Tacoma. We currently have about, go ahead and move to the next. Yeah, we currently have a little over 48,000 undergraduate, graduate, and professional students enrolled in our degree programs on the Seattle campus. Of our students, about 17% of our total student population are international students, and the graphic on the screen does show predominantly where our students, the top 10 countries where our students are coming from. Biggest one area is mainland China, and then the other countries, India, South Korea, Taiwan, are up there as well. So this is where our students are coming from, or primarily our international students are coming from. And then at the University of Washington, about 63% of our general operating budget comes from tuition dollars, primarily the non-resident tuition dollars, and only 27% comes from our state government, which about 15 years ago that was reversed, and about 60% of our operating budget came from the state, and a small portion came from tuition. And so this has flip-flopped over the years, which has definitely had some effect on our enrolling non-residents, and particularly international students and US non-residents from outside of Washington State. Go to the next slide. So what has happened so far? Here, because our academic year starts in September and ends in June, in early March, when actually the first actually, let's go back. February. In February, the first case of COVID-19 to arrive in the US was here in Washington State. They have since actually determined that there were other cases in California, but at the time we did not know that. And so in early March, we were about to make our admissions decisions, and on March 6th and March 7th, we released our admission decisions to about 45,000 first-year students. That following week is when our offices all were closing and moving our services online, which was a little hectic because we had just released our admission decisions. So we had to very quickly pivot and try and figure out how to move our 40+ staff to remote working. Also, all of our student ambassadors who answer our phones, our emails, that do chats and Q&A info sessions with our incoming prospective students. All of this was swirling at that moment when we released our decisions, and basically the university started to move all of our services online and to a remote world. So we very quickly had to record videos for online events. We moved our virtual admitted student preview program, or I'm sorry, we moved our admitted student preview program to a virtual program, which we did in less than 2 weeks. We had to kind of develop and build out the content for that. And then we also had to quickly, we had an old campus tour that was a virtual campus tour that we were able to bring back and update. And so that all happened in a matter of days. That was a complete whirlwind time for me. I barely remember what was happening because of how many decisions we had to make and how quickly we had to turn everything around. And at the same time, we were still responsible, as we all are, for bringing in this class at a time when everything was uncertain. And decisions, you know, we had released the decisions, but at this same moment when we were pivoting, families were pivoting and students were trying to figure everything out. And here in the US and outside, I mean, all around the entire world, things were changing very rapidly. So, but we still needed to bring in this class, and we're still working on that because obviously we're not there yet and there's still a lot unknown. But we did hold to our May 1 confirmation deadline. A lot of schools in the US did postpone or delay their confirmation deadline to June 1, but we decided to go ahead and hold on to the May 1 deadline because it did have a downstream impact on other things that the students needed to start planning. So things like housing and our advising and orientation, all of these things that they couldn't start those procedures until after students had confirmed. So we held with our May 1 confirmation deadline, but also made it known that students would be able to ask for an exception if they needed it. As I already mentioned, our campus by about middle of March, the third week of March, we basically all of our offices moved to in-person services, or I'm sorry, not in-person services, which meant no students could come to campus. We had no way to meet with students one-on-one other than virtually, which we did start to do. Definitely financial uncertainty, both here in the US and around the world. So students, you know, whose families had maybe lost jobs or certain, you know, financial situations were changing. And so whether students would be able to afford to come was big. And then of course, the whole remote learning and travel and visas has been a very hot topic. So just to quickly wrap up, I'll go to my last slide, which talks about what are some of the things that looking ahead and what do we plan to do. So we're already in discussions about fall and the next year's class, and doing virtual college fairs and school visits, online presentations and webinars. We've already been setting up that, trying to improve and continue our virtual campus tours, and also trying to make our print materials that normally we would be giving to students, trying to make those a little bit more accessible and easy for students to navigate online. Really trying to, another thing we're striving to do is how do we provide touch? I mean, absolutely students need that one-on-one in-person experience, but how can we try and give them some kind of personal touch so that they feel like they're really connecting with the institution and our staff and our advisors. We also very much are looking down the road to how we can diversify our applicant pool, so we're not relying on just one city or one main city or one state or one region or one country when we're looking at where our students and applicants are coming from. And then I think the hardest thing that we have right now here in the US is there's a lot of negative media, continuous presidential orders coming out that are restricting various visa processes or options for students, like work employment opportunities after graduation, and that rumor mill just keeps churning, and every time you know, another order comes out, I think it sends a shockwave amongst international students, and it's really hard to you know, kind of keep everything positive and to continue promoting US education when international students around the globe are seeing such negative comments and postings about international students in the US. So I'll stop there and look forward to answering some questions in a little while.
Thank you, Kim. That was really informative. I'd like to introduce now Professor Paul Tonks, who's the Associate Vice President for International Affairs at Yonsei University, which is in Seoul in South Korea. Sorry, Paul. Would you like to start your presentation?
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great, perfect. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm having some slight technical difficulties here because there's some things going on in the building, but I'm glad that everybody can hear me okay. Let me start off on an optimistic note. If we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. In a nutshell, actually, what we're seeing here at Yonsei and in Korea, and perhaps I think this might be part of the bigger picture of, whilst one doesn't want to be complacent or speak too soon, I guess in general, Korea has been receiving quite a lot of plaudits for its response to the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of, you know, public health and public administration and so on. So actually, we're not seeing a negative impact on degree-seeking international student applications. You know, we're actually thinking that there's probably going to be a bit of an increase. In fact, I mean, obviously there's quite a variation amongst you know, departments and programs, but the college in which I'm a faculty member, I actually have a very hectic day on Friday because I'm expecting to interview 123 international applicants. So that's probably going to take up a fair old proportion of my time on Friday. So I'd like to be reasonably positive about that. Obviously, in the short term, we had to switch to making all of our education programs online this semester during the spring semester. So I'm teaching online and my colleagues are teaching online. Yeah, so where we've had obviously a negative impact or disruption in the short run has been in terms of our student mobility, and that's one of my sort of key responsibilities, our exchange programs, you know, partnership programs. So we've seen, and you can see the data there. Obviously this semester there's been a very significant sort of 2/3 drop in the number of inbound students. There were obviously some students that were already here, you know, in country and so forth. And our calendar is a little bit different in Korea than it is in many other places around the world, such as the US, for example. We're also kind of expecting probably that you know, things may be challenging next semester. I think a lot building on what Kim was saying, you know, governmental responses, various kind of, you know, regulations and issues about visas and indeed, you know, travel, airlines and so forth. I mean, in principle, the recent data we had actually for numbers of students applying to come in as exchange program students and visiting students was 1,000 plus. So actually, I think was basically a record number for the full semester, but we're thinking in practice that things may work out, you know, probably quite a bit lower due to those various sort of somewhat unpredictable impacts of kind of regulations and disruptions and so on. I said, not so much from the Korean end, but perhaps from our colleagues in places like the US, you know, from government advisories and restrictions and so on. One also other big short-term impact, Yonsei has run for about the last 3.5 decades a very substantial international summer school program taught in English, diverse range of subjects. We have about 100 different courses or modules. We had to obviously cancel the physical program. We are offering some online courses. The next slide, please. And so in terms of academics, obviously Yonsei was already, like I'm sure many of our APRU colleagues, participating in a lot of online learning, Coursera and other things. And so we have, you know, opened up and engaged a lot with online learning. Like we're doing here today, we've been putting together a number of webinars, looking at, for example, you know, one from more the sort of social science and policy perspective that we ran last month. We're also looking, Yonsei has a very big, you know, health system, medical school, and hospitals. And so we have a program, in fact, today on the clinical features, future prospects of COVID-19. You know, we have a lot of faculty that are leading in terms of clinical treatment, you know, virology research. Actually, that links to my next point. Some of our partners have talked a little bit about what we might do in terms of learning. If you can just go back, sorry, the previous one. You know, academics on COVID-19. So we're putting together a course for our winter program. I mean, we're hoping that we can offer that physically. I was just able to confirm the other day, the CEO of the Institut Pasteur in Korea, part of the Pasteur network of you know, virology and public health on communicable diseases and so forth. He'll teach you know, one of our lectures. He's a biochem professor here. We focused a lot on, obviously, digital literacy. That was already a bit of a priority for us before this hit. And one of the things I'll try to wrap up quickly here, global partnerships and cooperation. As we heard from Kim a moment ago, obviously there are a lot of Korean students that study abroad. One of the things we're trying to do is to work with our international partners to offer things where if they're in country, you know, Korean citizens, they can take a number of courses at Yonsei, and then they can also take online courses, for example, at a partner university in the US or perhaps Australia or, you know, other partners across the APRU. Another example would be through one of our other alliances, and there's overlap here, you know, the ARU, a specific case, obviously, APRU partner in Canada, UBC. We're in discussion about how we might work together to do online classes and collaboration. So I'll leave it there and look forward to us answering questions and discussions in due course. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Paul. I'd like to introduce our third presenter now. So I'd like to introduce my colleague, Shane Griffin. Shane is the Executive Director of Sydney Future Students at the University of Sydney. Shane.
Yeah, thanks, Tanya. And just as a bit of a quick background, as you can probably see from the building, the University of Sydney is Australia's oldest university, which makes it old in Australian terms, but quite young in university terms. We have about upwards of 70,000 students, and we have more than 40% of those students are international students. So this has been a a big deal in the Australian context and a particularly big deal at the University of Sydney. I look after all of international student recruitment, but also all of admissions, global mobility, and all of our widening participation efforts. If we just move on to the next one. In the Australian context, we work on basically a calendar year. Our main intake period is semester 1, which starts on the 24th of February. So the Christmas-January period is a very busy time of year for us in an admissions context. This year we had the added excitement of the bushfires, which dominated the Australian landscape for a large part of December and January. That was a pretty big deal at the time. But if we just move on to the next slide, this is what happened around our current dates. So the timing as far as the outbreak of COVID-19 probably could not have been worse than it was in an Australian context. Most of our students look to arrive on the 24th of February. Our main intake group of international students for semester 1 is from mainland China. And those borders closed basically with 24 hours notice on the 1st of February, about a month before the start of our semester. So that led to a whole bunch of scrambling very quickly early on. We went from having travel restrictions just from the Hubei region on the 29th of January to borders being closed completely to China on the 1st of February. We had students who were mid-flight partway through who got to the airport and got turned back to China. So we had to deal with those challenges as well. And we work to a census, which is where we try and wrap everything up as far as the admissions process goes, students paying their fees, changing between courses and units of study. That's on the 31st of March. And it seemed throughout that period that each week something new would happen. In fact, not even each week, each day something new would happen to basically complicate matters further. It was certainly a very challenging period. And we moved all our teaching online by the 23rd of March. And that basically meant we had to run an online offering as well as a face-to-face offering for a while, and then it had to move online after about the 3rd week of teaching. We had more than 7,000 of our students who were caught offshore and unable to return. So it's not an insignificant number of students that we've had to manage. If we just move on to the next slide. So looking at what's next, I think the key thing I think we need to recognise is that there has been some sort of global health challenge every sort of 5 to 10 years in the last 20 years, and we shouldn't expect that this is going to be the last. And I think we also should expect that governments around the world are going to react very quickly to a future global health incident. So we need to prepare for the next pandemic and be prepared to shut down as quickly as we can. One of the things that really impressed me at this institution was their ability to make decisions quickly, which I speak frankly is perhaps not something that universities are known for. But the speed at which developments occurred meant that we had to respond, and we were able to, and we made decisions really quickly, and all of our teaching went online basically within the space of a few days. It was a really impressive effort, and our academic community did an outstanding job managing to make that happen. I think in the next steps, one of the other things we need to consider is, and related to that is how we manage our international recruitment using more in-country representatives. So we have representatives at the moment in Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, a few other countries, but given the travel restrictions that are ongoing, I think it's going to be increasingly important that we have the capacity to continue our recruitment whilst dealing with travel restrictions. So that's something that we'll be looking at in the coming months and years. Another thing that we really struggled with that I think will need to change in the future is the flexibility of the regulators. So our Australian regulators have restrictions on the amount of online teaching we can provide to international students. We had to very quickly get feedback from them on what flexibility they would provide to our students who were stuck overseas. We also had challenges with international regulators who have restrictions on the amount of online learning that their residents can do at international universities. So it took a while to get a response from the Chinese Ministry of Education around the capacity of Chinese students who were studying with us to undertake their studies online. that was a source of significant anxiety for a lot of our students who were worried that their degree might not be recognised. So I think one of the outcomes that I think we need to push for as we move through the pandemic is how do we enable those regulators to act more flexibly, more quickly in the future, and recognise that the relationship we will have with online learning is going to be different in the future to what it's been in the past. From our perspective, some other things that we want to do is look to retain those strengths in online and remote learning that we have gained. So, as I said, we are the oldest university in Australia. We're not the furthest along the line with online learning, but we have caught up very quickly. It's really important that we retain the key skills that we've developed in this period and don't sort of go back to the way things were once we're able to. And finally, the other big thing that has been apparent through this is that we have not won the public relations battle about the value of international students. So universities in Australia have been conspicuous in the lack of support they have received from the federal government here. We know the value that the international education market provides to this country. It is in the tens of billions. However, it hasn't been as widely recognised from the government, and I think it has made apparent that we have to do a better job of selling the virtues of what we do in the educational sector, in the international educational sector. So I'll leave it at that, but I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Shane, Kim, and Paul. There's some really good questions coming through, but and if people can keep sending those through, that would be fantastic. But I'd like to start off by asking the three of you a question, if I may, which is, throughout the whole of this process, you've all touched on innovation and touched on how you've had to be quick to respond and different expectations and stuff. I'd like to ask, what is it that you've learned about your own practice and what you've been doing in your space that surprised you, that you'd like to keep on doing?
So from our perspective, in a recruitment world, we moved our recruitment activities digitally really quickly. And we have been really impressed at the level of engagement we've been able to achieve with those online recruitment activities. So we've had higher numbers engaging, and I suspect that that's partly because there's been a bunch of people sitting at home with not much else to do. So it's an appealing thing to learn some more about. But I think it's also enabled us to get past some of the blockers in the recruitment sense and be able to talk more directly to students and their parents without necessarily having to go through, say, their schools or agents or in some cases. So I think that's something that we'll look to retain in the future.
Yeah.
Thanks, Shane.
Can I?
Paul?
Yeah. Can I pick up? I think everybody can hear me now, hopefully. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's very, very similar to what Shane was saying. I think he made a great point. You know, perhaps when you're a large organization, that sort of flexibility and speed is not what you associate with sort of decision making and adaptation. But I think we've done a reasonably, you know, good job considering it's been sort of a, you know, sometimes a set of moving goalposts and things happening and changing so quickly. I think also, as Shane was saying, I mean, you know, candidly, and obviously, you know, I've been to you know, many campuses and you know, worked with colleagues across you know, APRU. I mean, especially closely with Sydney, because obviously one of our strategic partners, but also, you know, Washington and elsewhere. We've certainly tried to adapt quickly to the digital, again, as Shane was saying, you know, communicating. I mean, obviously Korea has a pretty good reputation for its sort of, you know, online and you know, web and digital things anyway, but I think we've been pretty good at that kind of engagement. But obviously it's something that we wouldn't want to sort of rest on laurels or take for granted. We realize that we have to do a job of actively communicating. And I think for Korea, you know, we are obviously, we want to do more in terms of you know, having international students coming here. You know, I guess traditionally in many ways, Korea's, as has come out, some of the data we've already heard, obviously Korea's been kind of an exporter, you know, of students and, you know, participating in international higher education, a lot sort of outbound. But we have seen, I think, you know, big trends over the last few years. I mean, obviously we have practical challenges with some of those restrictions on travel, government restrictions, particularly perhaps on the other end. But obviously things are coming in now in Korea where there are, you know, quarantine procedures. You know, we adapted to that pretty well as well. You know, people coming in from all over, whether it was mainland China, whether it was the States or whatever, and we were able to quarantine them and give a lot of support, you know, on campus. So I think, you know, that's been pretty impressive, but obviously we have to continue to learn lessons and continue to be sort of adaptive and innovative.
Thanks, Paul. So Kim,
I would just add that one of the things that I've been, I think, very excited about, I mean, it was challenging to so quickly move everything online and remotely, but with seeing what we were able to do in such a short amount of time, I think all of us are now wondering if we had more time to actually strategize and plan and create online content and you know, programs, that what we could do. And so I think right now as we're kind of moving and looking forward, we're excited about, well, look at what we've already done and look at what potentially we may be able to do with the right tools, the right software, the right platforms, things that maybe we weren't prepared for yet. Not that we didn't want to get there, but they were things that maybe were lower priority, and now they've all been pushed to the forefront. And I think from someone who does international recruiting, I'm so excited about the opportunities that, you know, we moved our admitted student preview online, and I'm like, could we do this every year now? Because we'll be able to reach students that we never reached before because they weren't able to physically come to campus. So all of these things that we've moved online have opened up our campus to students outside of our area that we normally may not have had a chance to reach. So I think that's exciting.
Thanks, Kim. So I'm just going to throw one other question out to you guys before we start answering the questions that have been posted by the participants. And I suppose my question is, it's everybody knows how important international student recruitment is to universities, and I think colleagues at universities have become increasingly aware of that internally in the last few weeks as well. How are you managing internal expectations about what it's possible to do in the current climate, and what needs to happen, and how you need to engage colleagues internally in order to make that happen? I'm going to throw it to Shane first.
Oh, I was afraid you'd do that. We were in the position not 4 months ago where our main focus was on diversification of markets. And so mainland China is the main source of our students. Our efforts were going to be heavily focused on diversifying, not to diminish the importance of China, but to move to increase our activities in other areas. It hasn't removed the need for the focus on diversification, but it has meant that we have to re-energize our efforts with the China market as well. So that's a message that we need to sell internally too, that we have to adjust the plans that we had in place not 3.5 months ago to pivot now to re-energize the whole market. So that's part of what the next stage of it is. I think the other thing is it's changed so rapidly through this period that there has been some, it's been worthy in some sense to not act too quickly, because I've seen some institutions act really quickly and make a determination on something, and then things get worse and supersede any decisions that have been made. It took a long while to reach the bottom of this crisis. So I think the other point around how do we manage the expectations is to say, well, none of us have any experience in how this is going to pan out. So we have to sort of watch and see and be willing to be a bit reactive rather than be completely declarative around we're going to do this and we're going to do that, because every institution I've seen do that has been made to look a bit silly pretty shortly afterwards.
Yeah, perhaps, I don't know, maybe follow up on Shane. Hopefully I won't be kind of speaking out of turn, or I hope I won't be kind of sort of misinterpreted. I think in some ways we're actually fairly fortunate at Yonsei. You know, you can see the sort of logo behind me, and if any of you saw, you know, our now famous alumnus Bong Joon-ho, the Oscar-winning Paradise. Obviously, you know, Yonsei. We don't really need to sell Yonsei in Korea, to be honest. You know, we don't really. As I'm not sure if I should be saying this, but we don't really have to do a lot in terms of kind of getting Koreans to be interested in applying to Yonsei University. On the international recruitment front, I think we were also a little bit fortunate in that I don't have the exact data to hand, but I mean, number one, we don't have so high a proportion of international students. I mean, we have been increasing it. Obviously we'd like in many ways to increase it because there's a kind of flexibility there that we don't have, because obviously Korea, like many countries, particularly in Asia, I think, but not exclusively, there's a lot of government, kind of regulations, a lot of things to comply with and restrictions about, recruitment and programs at the undergraduate level. That's the kind of flip side of sort of, Yonsei's kind of prominence in sort of the Korean society and so forth. But I think we have been, let's say, kind of perhaps less dependent on China. We do have a fair number of Chinese students, and that would be a significant kind of market and place for us to target. I think one concrete thing, it's not really so much my own direct responsibility. I have to confess, one of my colleagues is probably more leading on that role, but we've tried to kind of put in place, shall we say, sort of kind of training programs and building some expertise and commitment so that we can have bodies of people within the university, particularly faculty, that can speak from their own experience, their own disciplinary perspective as research informed teachers and scholars. So we've tried to do that on two fronts, both Korean faculty and indeed the international faculty that we have, to get people to identify perhaps a core group, a sort of relatively small group of people that could be sort of committed to participate in recruitment efforts, because perhaps unlike, because of, I guess, differences in scale, let's say, we don't do a lot of, let's say, working with, companies and professional recruiters overseas. We actually have a lot of faculty involvement, engagement. People like myself can go and, visit schools and places in, let's say, whether it's within the Asia Pacific region or Europe or whatever. And so I think that's something that we're thinking about. How can we get people to kind of buy in and be committed? We don't know, obviously, when people will be able to travel and where we'd be able to visit and so forth. But, we're trying to sort of, I guess, build up the knowledge and expertise and commitment amongst sort of actually our faculty, both sort of, Korean faculty and international faculty.
Thanks, Paul. Kim, is there anything you want to add?
I would just say that for us, there's still just so much unknown and uncertainty. We, at the moment, our classes are online. We're in our final quarter for, main academic quarter before summer. Our students will be new students will be coming in September. We have not yet announced what the university will be doing. We don't, there is planning going on and many discussions. And I think right now, our focus is on how can we get our students, how will we be able to get our students back? One, the travel restrictions are still in place. So a lot of students from certain countries can't travel here right now. We still are in a stay-at-home order in Washington State, so especially King County and Seattle. And so, you know, there's just so much unknown, and I think that as we try and plan ahead, it's taking into consideration, okay, if the international students can't get here, what can we do to make sure that they are still able to take classes and make progress towards their degree, and just trying to be as flexible as possible. And it feels like right now we're just still putting out a lot of little fires.
Okay, thanks, Kim. So the first question that we've had in is about closed borders and student mobility. So how are you mitigating closed borders while still capturing student interest in mobility programs? Shall I throw that open to Shane to start with?
Sure.
You look after mobility.
The interesting thing for us is this is one we've actually had a little bit of time on because we had to cancel mobility so early. Our next main mobility period wouldn't be until the start of next year, so we have a bit of time. Our numbers in mobility have been really strong and grown a lot in recent years. The difficulty we'll have is that our key partners are in the United States. So I don't know how we're going to capture that. We're looking at some virtual exchange placements and partners at the moment, still in really early days, but that's an option. But I think a key part of exchange is the exchange part of it. That's going to be hard to replicate remotely, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just perhaps, building on what Shane was saying, I think I don't have the exact numbers to hand. I'm going to guess off the top of my head, it's probably something like maybe a third from the States, something like that. But, you know, over the last few years, we've obviously had trends where, you know, maybe one wouldn't necessarily expect. As I said, I think it's part of a variety of phenomena of it, obviously, you know, increased prominence of Korean, you know, companies, you know, trade links and so forth. Obviously, a lot of the cultural stuff, you know, I'm mentioning obviously some of the, you know, Korean cinemas and dramas and music and all that kind of stuff. So we would have a lot more students. Let's say something like Europe, I think would be about a fifth of our exchange partners. Obviously, a lot within the, you know, kind of ASEAN region, you know, Southeast Asia and so forth, where there's very strong links. I mean, in many countries, you know, Vietnam, I think Korea is the biggest single kind of investor these days. We have, as I was saying, I think in my talk, I think it's you know, we had about 1,000+ applicants for those kind of mobility programs. I mean, I don't know how that's going to work out because obviously, you know, let's say the American government, you know, may well have restrictions that are ongoing, and even some of the practicalities, you know, like my understanding is that you know, a lot of the services, you know, issuing passports, you know, various immigration things are not being offered at the moment, you know, so often it's sort of on the other end of the equation, as it were. And we are still expecting, you know, obviously all being well, people coming in if you know, they're able to do so. Of course, we're not quite sure if we have to have, as Tanya was saying, a kind of mixture, that kind of blend of online and offline. We found obviously sometimes, I mean, I've met a couple of students, you know, just sort of personally that, let's say, you know, that they're, I said, I have to be a bit careful how I phrase it, but, you know, they're from the States, for example, and they, you know, they chose to stay on and were like kind of, you know, that was a good decision that I decided to stay for the spring semester, you know, even though we've got online learning, you know, that they're able to obviously, as I said, you know, find opportunities and things to do and sort of benefit from being in Seoul and in Korea and so forth, even though obviously the campus isn't fully open and what have you. Yeah.
Thank you. You got anything to add to that, Kim? If not, we'll.
Yeah, I would echo what they've already said. And then also it's just, again, that's a big unknown for us because the US embassies and consulates are still
Mhm.
closed around the world. We are hearing rumors that certain cities are scheduling visa appointments, but
Mhm.
it's very city by city or region by region. And so we're hopeful that our students will be able to get visas to travel and come. But yes, I know, like our study abroad office, they've been in lots of discussions about what does the exchange look like if the students actually can't come. And it's not just that they can't come because we're not offering classes in person, it's because of all the visa restrictions and travel restrictions that may also prevent students from physically being able to arrive.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So the next question is specifically for you, Paul, and it's just, will Yonsei be operating an online winter school?
That's a really good question. I can't give a definitive answer. I do have obviously key responsibility for the winter school. I mean, our aim would be to do a physical program, you know, physical on-campus program. And as I said, we're trying to innovate things like a sort of team-taught COVID-19 course that looks at the sort of multi-dimensional impacts and obviously Korean perspectives as well as the sort of international perspective. Our hope is to offer a physical course, and that's grown a lot over the last few years. I mean, for example, obviously our friends in Sydney, you know, we have many students from the University of Sydney and indeed elsewhere in Australia. So a lot of growing interest, I think, across the kind of, you know, the ASEAN and Asia Pacific region more broadly. So we'd like to do a physical program, and I guess, you know, if circumstances dictate it, you know, and it might be a partial, it might be a blended thing, you know, but it may be necessary for us to do an online rather than an offline. But you know, we'll obviously hope for the best and try and prepare accordingly.
Thanks, Paul. And a follow-up question from that, and this will be the last question on mobility before we go on to other subjects, and this is from Fiona White, and it was, do you think universities across the world in general will view virtual mobility as much as a value add as true mobility experience, and are your institutions planning on offering virtual mobility opportunities?
So from our perspective, we're considering it, but yeah, as I said, I mean, I'm sure it'll have value. It's whether it has the same value is the question. So it's probably a bit early for us to say. I'd like to think so, but I'm a little bit skeptical.
Yeah, I would echo Shane. I mean, in a sense, we'd be sort of like, I think, well, obviously it's a genuine, I think, real kind of, you know, hopefully honestly held opinion. And, you know, partly I was going to sort of joke, we'd be doing ourselves out of a job to some degree, wouldn't we, if everything was kind of, you know, virtual. But I think, you know, obviously one has to adapt and do one's best in challenging circumstances. But I think realistically, you know, a lot of the cultural and social aspects and you know, just beyond the classroom, beyond the curriculum and so on. I mean, as we've talked about, we're trying to do things, we're trying to adapt, innovate, offer new things, obviously. But let's be honest, I think, you know, one of the reasons why we're all participating in this is because we actually think that the real value is people getting to know each other and interacting. And it's a huge dimension is the sort of interpersonal and intercultural experiences and connections, isn't it?
And I would just add that I think it's too soon to know. I think it has opened our eyes to what possibilities are out there, but I think the university is committed to our on-campus programs and bringing our students to campus. And so, you know, could they create and develop programming that could be offered remotely for some programs? Certainly, but I don't think that that's going to be a shift or a move. I think it would be more of an option for certain maybe programs that want to reach a larger audience. A lot of our programs are already capacity constrained and filled to the maximum, so I don't see them wanting to broaden even more by opening it up. But in the short term, in what we need to do right now to make sure that our students can continue to degree, absolutely, they're going to do whatever they can to make sure that students have what they need to get their classes.
Thanks, Kim. I'm going to bring a couple of questions together for the next question because they're both touching on the idea of the student experience. So one is from Binashri King from the University of Malaya, and Binashri was asking that they'd like to know, how do you provide a personal touch through online teaching and learning? So how do you keep that personal touch in place? And the other one is from John Shields, and I'm assuming this is our John Shields from the University of Sydney, but unless there's another one out there, but I find that hard to believe. And this is for universities that have previously been campus-based, we now have pivoted to online. How do we craft a new value proposition to international students that blends online, on campus, and on the job working learning? So it's how do we keep the experience real for students and that personal touch whilst we're online, but also how do we then go to the next stage and think about how we blend that?
Perhaps I could jump in on the first one, and I'll maybe sort of duck the second for the moment. But the first one, obviously, I am, I have a sort of, inverted commas, regular job as a teaching faculty too. Perhaps in some ways, I feel a little bit fortunate in that I do have a reduction this semester, but I am doing an undergraduate seminar course actually in British and Irish history. And, personal touch, I've been doing that principally through Zoom, through the kind of format that we're doing here, and obviously try to encourage, actively participating, jumping in with questions, getting students to share, their perspectives. So in some ways, to be honest, it hasn't been, I mean, it's not ideal, I'd prefer the sort of, classroom, like physical classroom, but I think a lot depends on, I mean, obviously something like the size of the course. I mean, that's a kind of small seminar course. So I've got like a wee bit under 20 students. Obviously my colleague here in the international office who's teaching a more like lecture-based course and to 150 students or whatever, that would be a little bit different, isn't it? I think there's issues of sort of scale. But we do hear feedback, I know, from students. We've obviously had a lot of surveys, the student council's been surveying people, our academics office have been, surveying students. And obviously one of the key concerns is that, personal engagement and personal touch, getting faculty to directly, respond to students and kind of be available for consultations and things. And so, yeah, I think a lot depends on the format of the course, the scale, number of students and so forth. But for me, I've tried to just be, doing it in many ways a similar kind of format to what I normally do, just like open up questions and get students to comment and ask things in the sort of online class.
Thanks. Shane?
Yeah, I think I'm probably, well, I'm not qualified to talk about the teaching side of things as I'm not a teacher, but perhaps to John's point, I think the students have been voting with their feet about what they think about large in-class lectures for a decade or more now. And I think this crisis has forced us in a direction that frankly the students were pushing us anyway, just a lot faster than we would have otherwise. I think the value proposition of what we offer on campus is enhanced because we can, they weren't coming to sit in a large lecture hall, but they are coming to have a campus experience. So we need to find a better way to engage with them. And one of our challenges, and I know John will know this better than anyone, is how do we provide a personalised experience at scale? And I think part of that is removing the requirement to sit in a room with 500 other students and listen to a lecture for an hour is part of that process. And then to break it down into those smaller groups. But that obviously has other implications around costs and so forth. Sure. So there's no, I'm not suggesting it's in any way easy, but it is forcing us in a direction that we wanted to go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would just quickly add that, I mean, again, I can't speak on the teaching side because I too am not I don't teach, but I do oversee our International Student Services Office. And I know in a very short amount of time, we had to move a lot of our procedures to a online friendly environment, which is something we have been wanting to do. We just didn't have the time and dedication, and we were forced to do it very quickly, but it is the direction that the students wanted. I mean, they want the on-demand, I mean, for our services, I'm not talking about classes right now, but for our services, they wanted the on-demand, when I want it at 3 a.m. in the morning, I want it. And so, you know, where our advisors were very much only available during the traditional work day, and that doesn't always fit with what our students want. And so a lot of this has opened up, has forced us to move quickly. And again, I think it can be better with more time and planning. And one of the things the University of Washington is looking at is exactly what Shane was just saying about this fall. One of the possibilities is that we will have all classes of a certain size and above will be remote, and then smaller classes that we can properly social distance will meet in person. And so have that hybrid model where they're getting, you know, the larger lecture class virtually, and then personal, more small group discussions and coursework or labs in person.
Thanks, Kim. So I'm being told to wrap up, but I've negotiated one more question because we still have 8 that are unanswered, and they're really good. This one's going to be pretty, so it's not going to be really specific, but it's quite an interesting question. So this one is from Thira Subramanian from the University of Malaysia. And what Thira is asking is, what do we think the economic impact is going to be of C19 on countries like Malaysia that have promoted themselves in the context of a global education hub? So if global education is undermined by C19, what happens to those countries that position themselves as a global education hub?
That's a tricky one.
No, go ahead, Shane. Yeah, go ahead.
No, please, Paul, you go first.
Well, I'm gonna. I'll try to, because I think, you know, Shane and Kim are probably much more competent to address that than me. I always like to joke as a historian, you know, a nod to my friends in the sciences. You know, the Niels Bohr predicting things is always difficult, especially the future. So, you know, to me, it's kind of challenging enough being a historian and looking at kind of past things, that the future's a challenge. I mean, but joking aside, I think it's a question of perspective, sort of short, medium, long term. You know, the short term, obviously, one hopes, and there's a lot of variation between countries, you know, partly the governmental, the regulations, you know, the immigration issues and so forth. And obviously, you know, number one, just the public health, you know, how they're actually dealing with the situation. Obviously, there's huge differences if you're somewhere like, you know, New Zealand or Australia, you know, to Malaysia or the US and what have you. And I think there's obviously going to be short-term, presumably a lot of negative economic consequences. I think in the medium to longer run, I think in the long run, we won't see, I think we'll still see people wanting international experience. And I don't think, and I think, you know, countries like Malaysia, that have really sought to internationalize and work with partners. You know, they've obviously got a lot of the sort of overseas campus models and things like that. I mean, I don't think that there'll be a negative in the medium to longer run. I think it's more of a question of the timescale, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree, Paul. I think the other thing too is this is the point I was sort of trying to make in the presentation I gave earlier, is that we should be better prepared for this the next time it happens. We should be able to be more adaptable for the next time borders shut down, for the next time we can't get students in from a particular country. If we can retain a level of flexibility to enable us to deal with it, then the need for international education isn't going away. That remains. It's just a matter of how we set ourselves up to manage it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kim, anything to add?
Here in the US, I mean, I think the biggest, being somebody who's been in international education for almost 25 years, it's extremely frustrating to see the underappreciation and value of international education right now by our US administration. And I think that's our biggest challenge. One of our biggest challenges here in the US is, you know, this situation has, in a way, almost driven our students home because of, you know, nervousness about being here in the US, and first of all, the reaction to COVID-19. And I feel very strong here in our state. We have a wonderful governor who is doing a great job in making sure that we don't rush things and you know, get right back into the situation where we need to close everything down again. But you know, across the US, it's not like that, and there's a lot of mixed messages about let's hurry and get back and open up the economy and things like that. But then on the flip side, there's also, you know, things like there's been a lot of rumors over the last couple of weeks that the president is about to announce something that will minimize or put more restraints on the optional practical training benefit, which is a great benefit that draws a lot of international students to US because they get to have that employment experience after graduation and have that kind of work experience. And so, I mean, international students bring something like $40 billion to the US economy. And I just feel like all of our visa restrictions and travel restrictions and, you know, on and on and on, the layers of restrictions is just creating this very negative, unwelcoming message. And I am concerned about, I think we're all concerned about what that's going to do, you know, in the immediate, but also a few years or several years down the road.
Thanks, Kim. So I have to wrap up at this point. It's a shame we've got through half the questions. The other half of the questions are just as good as the first half. So I'm saying to maybe Elaine and Christopher, maybe we'd want to do a part 2 of this at some point. There's obviously a lot of interest, and the participants haven't dropped off even though we've run over. I'd like to thank Shane, Kim and Paul for giving up their time today. Really informative. And I'd like to thank APRU for hosting this, and hand it back to you, Elaine. Thank you. And Christopher.
So thank you again, Kim, Paul, and also Shane for your wonderful sharing, and also Tanya for your wonderful moderation. And thank you everybody for joining. So please stay tuned of APRU Plus events, and we hope to see you next time. Stay safe and have a good day, a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.